Next, I'd like to introduce Donald Cohen, our first speaker for the day. Donald Cohen is the founder and executive director of In the Public Interest, a national resource and policy center on privatization and responsible contracting. Donald has worked on anti-privatization campaigns for a decade and is the author of the upcoming book, The Privatization of Everything: How the Plunder of Public Goods Transformed America and How We Can Fight Back. You can pre-order his book on bookshop.org, and I believe we'll link to that on the Grand Alliance webpage as well. And the Public Interest is a tremendous resource on all fights around privatization around the country, from efforts to dismantle public schools to privatizing water, and yes, the struggle around privatizing the Postal Service. He'll tell us a little bit about the perils of privatization in other industries. Don, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you very much, Chastity. I put our website also in the chat, and we have a lot of information, and you can sign up for our emails. Some of us do a lot of Zooming. So if you don't know, you can there's two views. There's at the top, on top right, it says view. You could go to gallery view where you see everybody in little boxes, so you have to find me, or you can go to speaker view where I'll come up bigger. But you may not want to see me, so you might want to keep it on the gallery view, which would be fine as well. So I am not going to talk about privatization of the Postal Service, although it is an enormous threat. So I was asked to talk about privatization more in general. But the lessons I'll give from other industries, and I'm really going to talk about the bigger impacts of privatization and the bigger dynamics, are completely relevant to postal communications. So I'm going to do big picture I'm going to go in different places. So first off, we're talking about every kind of public service. There is outsourcing of custodians in schools and buildings, to selling private prisons, to individual companies, to vouchers in schools. I could go down a list, but everything you could think of that is a public service has been privatized, has been contracted out, or has been sold off. Things that we deal with all the time. I'll just give a little list and you can kind of think more. Social services, Medicaid and foster care, transit systems, water and wastewater systems, schools, libraries, every kind of city service. The VA hospitals are under threat. Medicaid, as I already mentioned, was already privatized in Kansas and Iowa, I believe. It literally everything that you think of as a public good or a public service is up for grabs at some level. So privatizers say private companies do it cheaper, better, faster. That's what we hear all the time. So if you're looking at this in other sectors, you may be surprised to find out that that's not true. And so just a couple of reasons for that. So they say they do it for less. Here's how they save money. They save money by taking good middle-class jobs with decent wages and pensions and turn them into lower wage jobs with less benefits and sometimes no pensions at all. That's one of the ways they save money. The second way that money is saved is by cutting corners, by giving lower quality services. But what's important about it, the question is, what do they do with those savings? Because there's a whole bunch of money when things are privatized that are taken from that are diverted from the delivery of the service to profits, to high CEO salaries, to debt service when they buy up other companies, to paying dividends. Those are all money that could be used for the delivery of a service, whether it's a worker's wage or whether it's more workers or whether it's whatever you need to do the work. That's money that's being taken out of the system. So surprisingly, when you add all that up, it actually costs more. So I could give you a ton of examples in every one of those sectors of things that went wrong and failures and all of that. And you should feel free to, we're going to have questions and answers, and you should feel free to start, putting them in the chat. I'm going to try not to look at it, but someone can wave their hand and say stop. Mari is really good at that. I want to tell you what it's really all about. So I am going to ask you, you all know where the chat box is. I'm going to ask a question. I want to ask you just real quick, we're not going to spend a lot of time, is how much, and no Googling to find out the answer, how much do you think is spent in America by all governments, state, local, and federal? Just one number. Just come up with it, give your best guess and put it in the chat. Just gonna give you a second. I don't. Okay. And I assume everyone can see those. There's some pretty smart folks. Okay. So, so we've got some good answers here, all over the map, but I don't think anyone's got it right. Someone came close. Oh, and a couple of people went over. It's a, and I haven't looked, most recently, but it's a, and I'm certainly not after the stimulus that got passed, but $7 trillion a year. So it's important when you think about private, so that's, keep that number in mind. It's important when you think about privatization, it's companies taking over public goods, public services and goods. I want to tell you what privatization is really all about, and remembering that number. First thing is, it's important to remember one thing about private companies. They only do one thing. They sell stuff. That's all they do. And all they care about are three metrics, or 3 or 4 metrics: profits, revenue, and sales, revenue, profits, and market share. That's their whole world. It's important to keep that in mind. So the 3 things that I think privatization is really all about is, one is it's about the cash. Let's just be clear. Everything else is wraparound. All the cheaper, better, faster, and all that. It is a, they're not stupid. There's $7 trillion at stake. They want money. They want revenue. So that's the first thing. Second, it is about eliminating breaking unions, obviously particular public sector unions. You get rid of, it's a twofer. You get cash and you kill unions. The third thing it's about is more ideological. There are free market ideologues. They're for real. They're not in it for the money. They're true believers that fundamentally want to redefine our relationship with government, where instead of being citizens and residents with rights and responsibilities, we become individual consumers in the marketplace for public services where you only get what you can pay for. That's their worldview. That's one of the drivers of privatization. So I want to go now I want to go a little step further and talk about, how this really works and what's really at stake. I believe that privatization is fundamentally at its core, and I'll give some examples, an assault on democracy and public control over public goods. And I'm going to explain why that is, how that is. And the best way to do that, now these examples, is to actually look at some of the fine print of the contracts between private companies and state and local and federal governments. If you look there, you kind of see that, you see it. So I'll give a few examples. First, and some of these numbers may not be totally up to date, but the country spends about $80 billion on prisons and corrections. That may be a little off, it's maybe a couple of years old, and that does not include immigrant detention. So the 2 largest private prison companies, Geo Group, and they used to be called Corrections Corporation of America. They changed their name to CoreCivic. They generated $4 billion in revenues last year. CoreCivic CEO made $5.3 million in 2019. Don't have the 2020 data in his salary. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing, there's a lot of reasons to hate private prisons. We can go into all sorts of examples there. But it's important, as I said earlier, they sell things. In this case, they sell heads and beds. That's what they want. So they make more money when more people are in prisons and jails. Straight up simple. It's logical behavior for them as a corporation to want to sell more of those, because just take the judgment away. The bigger problem is we don't want that. We want fewer people in prison, and that hurts them. So that hurts their bottom line. That hurts their sales. When you look at corporate documents, when corporations that are traded on the stock exchange file documents every year to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they include, things that could threaten them, could be risks to their bottom line. So I'm going to read you one of them I think it's from CoreCivic, and they say, the demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain types of activities. In other words, marijuana legalization, sentencing reform. These are things that they see as risks to their bottom line. One of the ways, and they use their powers to try to prevent that. So one of the ways they do that is in their contracts. We looked at a bunch of state level private prison contracts a bunch of years ago, and 2/3 of them had bed guarantees. Keep the beds filled, 80, 90, somewhere 100%, or pay anyway. Okay, so that's contractual obligation to keep them whole. And you can kind of just think about the pressure that puts in the system to keep people in prison. Next example, and they obviously will use their political money and their lobbying money to help them as well. Second, another example, water and wastewater. We spend between 80 and $100 billion a year on water and wastewater in the country. About 1/3 of them are privately operated. There's lots of proposals that they're to privatize. Some of those are global companies. One of the largest companies, American Water, had $3.7 billion in revenues last year. The CEO made almost $6 million, $6 million in 2019. These are big numbers. So what do they see as impediments to growth and sales? The things they include, these are long documents, but one of the things they include in their list of risks are conservation programs that get people to use less water. Again, that's something we want. It's not in their interest. So they also have revenue guarantees in their contracts. Third, another example, public education. There's a company called K-12 Inc. that does virtual charter schools. It's all online now that everybody's online, but think pre-COVID, that just to get people to do that. Their CEO last year told on a call to investors, he talked about, this is quote, the upside of the pandemic for sales. And they spent a lot more money on advertising last year. But one of the things that they see as a risk and a threat are restrictions on class size caps, right? If you have a class size cap, they can put a gazillion people in one class if you're online, right? So, there's other things, there's privacy laws and other things they see as risks. The bottom line is they see all this stuff as kind of in their way to make more money, but it's against our interests. And then one last example I'll mention real briefly is about national infrastructure, because we're going to be hearing a lot about physical infrastructure over the next few months, and there'll be a debate in Washington. Roads and bridges and transit systems and all that, school buildings, broadband, hopefully will come up more. You're going to hear a lot about public-private partnerships. That's privatization of infrastructure. So in the fine print of these deals, some of which are like 75 years long, they prevent the public from creating transportation options that compete with the privatized, which means you put it in the fine print in the contract that you can't put a mass transit system next to a toll road that's been privatized because you made a deal and it would compete with them and it would reduce their revenues. That's a huge impact on transit, on climate change, if we want to get people out of cars, on sort of a whole set of things. So I want to finish by just kind of bringing this point home, and then we'll go to questions. So contracts are very rigid documents, right? So, but what happens is when you embed the interests of private companies in public services through these contracts, they get what I call skin in the game. And think about it from their side. They're an education company, or they're a prison company. They have to be, and they're traded on the stock market, and they have to, represent their do what they have to do as an obligation to their shareholders. They have to be involved in any policy at the local, state, or national level that could affect their bottom line. They got to be. It's the logic of corporate behavior. If they're about sales and growth. So, private prison companies have absolutely lobbied to increase sentencing standards over time. They don't do it as much anymore. Things have changed a little bit. And immigrant detention centers. They have huge operations to do this because they're about sales. So any money they spent in lobbying and politics and all that is about sales. Virtual, charter companies, will weigh in against class size caps, and we can go down the list. That's things that are not in their interest. Landfills, trash incinerators. I mean, I could go on and on and on. So it's, the important thing is their interests get embedded in the delivery of public services. And that's what I mean when I say this is an assault on democracy. Because if we have to keep their interests whole in a bed guarantee or another kind of guarantee, or they have, you know, they're increasing their power in lobbying and in politics, that prevents us from making sort of pretty much fundamental decisions about what matters to us. So there's a lot we can do. I'm not going to talk about things that we can do to wait for that. You know, we are winning some fights. There are fights that are being won. It is certainly not all lost. So my job was to tell you about what's wrong. So I did that. We can talk about people are winning. There is a short game and a long game fight. And so I'll leave that for Q&A and next time. I don't know what happens next. Chastity, do I send it back to you?
Yes, thanks, Donald. We have about 10 minutes for questions or reflections on Donald's presentation. Now we have some time to hear from you. Reminder, if you have a question, it's best to identify yourself by hitting the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. If you can't find that, you can also literally raise your hand or call yourself out in the chat. We'll call on you, ask you to unmute yourself, and you can direct your question to one of our speakers. The first question will come from Phil Tabitha.
Hi, Don. I got from your presentation that privatization isn't necessarily eliminating entirely some government operation, that in fact it's piecemeal. It can be done through outsourcing. And I certainly have noticed with the Postal Service that they have done a lot of outsourcing. In fact, the Postal Management wrote a paper about 20 years ago while Europe was liberalizing, claiming that they were more liberal, that 60% of postal operations were already in the private sector. Most of them were labor contracts for cheap labor, not for expertise. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, no, that's I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's one of the things I decided I didn't have time to say. Let's talk about what privatization is done in different ways. It's outsourcing, all or in part, as you described. I have to say it. I remember I used to live in San Diego, and I remember driving by the local post office, the local like Kinko's or something like that, and all of a sudden it said Postal Contract Unit. And I immediately called the head of the APWU that I knew and worked with. I said, "What's that?" It was privatized. It was like the Staples deals that they tried to do. So it's outsourcing, all or in part. It's also eliminating, I call it backdoor privatization. Budgets are cut. They decide they actually need to do it anyway, and then they hire in, temp agencies or contract to sort of so-called meet a temporary need that becomes permanent. And then in the bigger deals, these road deals and infrastructure targets, they're long-term leases, 50, 75-year long-term leases. That happens. So there's sort of a variety of ways they do it. You're absolutely right.
Thank you for that. The next question will come from Jamie Partridge. If you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. There's a lot of discussion among postal workers and among just the public that, well, the Postal Service would never be privatized. I mean, all these Republican Congress people, who represent rural districts, folks totally love their Postal Service. They would never, allow their Republican Congress people to vote for privatization of the Postal Service. And there was even an opinion piece in the Washington Post this week that basically said that, the privatization boogeyman is not real for the Postal Service. But of course, what you're talking about, and the previous speaker talking about, the piecemeal contracting out, and I just like to hear your thinking about how to talk with people about this. It's really not, the backdoor privatization is how it's happening, not so much the public you know.
Right, and they'll want to force the U.S. Postal Service into last mile and stuff like that, and let FedEx take I'm sure they've got all sorts of schemes to chop away. So I think it's a really good question. And before I get to your specific questions, like it's part of the strategy to make it possible to do the whole thing, right? Chop, weaken public support because everyone doesn't get the same, just wait for tiered pricing. Someone's going to suggest tiered pricing, right? Like they do for UPS. So the question about how you talk about it is, it's a longer discussion and training, and happy to do that for APWU, local unions. So what we try to say, we did a bunch of message research, and this may not get to your exact point, Jamie, but a bunch of years ago. And what we learned is that people don't necessarily know what's public and what's private, in the sense of, it's better, I use the example of a sanitation with a trash driver. No one knows who they work for, whether it's Waste Management, a private company, or the city, but they do know it's a public service, and they think we ought to have control over it, right? Right, so it's ours. It's not who, and so we've done a lot of training and a lot of thinking about that. It's really, that's really had an influence on our work. So again, I haven't thought about this in terms of the different pieces of, getting a letter from one place to another. But when you lose control of a piece of the delivery of goods, of medicines, of letters, of, packages and all that, you're going to lose something bigger than just jobs. We're all going to lose something there, because so I'd have to think about that, but there'll be real impacts that we could describe that not workers get it immediately, but the point is everybody else has got to get it, right? That everybody else gets, wait a second, we don't want to give them control over that, because that could affect this. As well as it's become so damn clear this year. This is, the mail is a national security issue. It's a health security issue. It's a public health issue, right? So those are kind of the places I go. Happy to talk more.
Thank you for that, Donald. The next question will come from Nelson Betancourt. If you can unmute yourself for the question.
Yeah, Don, I subscribe to your newsletter, fantastic newsletter. Can you talk a little bit about talk about the National Infrastructure Bank that is being talked about? And how do you see that being, how can we, the idea is for it to remain a public bank that makes loans in order to deal with the infrastructure problems. But, what kind of things, is there something that they can do upfront to prevent it from being taken over by public-private partnerships and that sort of thing? What kind of caveat do you have for them? Something to watch out for.
Yeah, that's a very big question and a very complex issue. So first, in terms of the infrastructure bank, there's different versions of the bank, and I'm not familiar with that. But the bottom line I'll say about infrastructure, then I'll see if I can get to the question in a simple way. And you all can follow up, and we have lots of stuff. We'll do more. One is, we just need cash to build stuff, right? And you could go to private money and pay a lot of money, or you can go to public money and get real cheap money, and we should be spending that. So that's number one. The second thing I say a lot is the easy part is raising the money. I mean, we raised $1.9 trillion. We can go to the Fed, we can go anywhere. The hard part is paying it back, right? So think about that when you think about privatization of roads, because they'll say, again, cheaper, better, faster. Bull. We're going to have to pay it back. So there's lots of guardrails and things that you could put into it. I mean, one, you could say no public-private partnerships, but that's not going to happen. I don't think we're worried about it. We are working on this some with some of our national union and other allies as it goes forward. But there are a lot of Democrats who think they're the right thing. There's a lot of Republicans who think they're the right thing. So we kind of go into the weeds in a very specific way, in asking those big picture questions. How are you going to pay it back? What do you know, are you going to allow features in these deals that would prevent us from doing mass transit if it's a road, like the example I gave before? So we have actually some documents on it. Nelson, if you want to kind of look on our website or email me, I think my email's there. I mean, I can point you right to it. We have a real strategy around stopping public-private partnerships that gets sort of a little bit in the weeds, but it raises these questions, because usually what happens is with all, and it's similar with all privatization. Oh, it's like a parade. Cheaper, better, faster, private sector good, government bad. And we say, wait a second. Let's ask a few of the hard questions, and then the argument that they have, they got to actually answer them. So that's a very short answer for a very big subject, but don't hesitate, reach out.
Thank you for that. We have one last question coming from Marjorie Harrison. Marjorie, if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that excellent presentation, Donald. It's really right on the money. I guess I shouldn't use that term, but very, very helpful. And the question I have is kind of coming from the kitchen table point of view and asking whether you have presented or know of any attempts, and you may know this may be a 101 type question, and if so, I apologize, but in terms of trying to explain to people, has there been an attempt to look at both the impact on household standard of living and cost of living, as well as the broader negative economic impacts on the American economy, like even the contribution to the hollowing out of the middle class, and trying to quantify that? Because I think for myself, one of the most important ways of coming back at people who genuinely believe the ideological arguments about the free market there, and they don't think it out of mean-spiritedness. They truly believe this is a better fit for human nature. And I always try to illustrate my point of view by pointing to facts that I know have an impact on them, and that's why I call them kitchen table. So I was just hoping you could maybe address that.
Well,
thank you.
First off, you're really out of touch. Facts are so passé. They're yesterday's news. So again, you have the greatest audience, Mark. Really smart. We could go on all day here. So there's lots of facts out there. For stuff like that, organizations, I'll go to the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, I'll go to CPR, I'll go to other places. And again, you can reach out, we could happy to direct. I have an idea that I'll share with you by looking at this. So, because how do we kill trickle down, right? How do we, but not just kill it, but say there's an alternative, and that's whatever you want to call it, trickle up, and, right? So why don't we take examples of, like, individual examples of companies or individuals that did better in the Trump tax cut, which was also happened to be conveniently 1.9, something like that, trillion, and compare that one by one with people who are getting stimulus checks, nurses who are going back, teachers who are going back to school, to show over time with sticky examples, with kitchen table examples of the difference between putting money in people's pockets or giving away tax cuts. And I think we could do that over time. And if we're all doing it, we got to do it in a way that kind of really adds up. But it's the ideological stuff at the kitchen table. Everybody's locked in. It's the did you know I think is a good strategy. But this is talking about big issues in a very short period of time. Happy to talk more.
Thank you all for the interesting discussion, and thanks, Donald, for joining us.